The ocean stretches like an endless sheet of steel, gleaming under the early June sun of 1942. From a distance, the Japanese fleet moves with the confidence of a predator certain of its kill. The air is heavy with salt, smoke, and the faint thrum of engines, machines that the admirals aboard believe will secure their empire's destiny. To them, the Americans are little more than a nuisance, carriers too fragile to be taken seriously, paper tigers destined to burn. Now pause for a moment. Imagine standing on the deck of one of those Japanese carriers. The crew shouts in clipped voices, boots clattering on steel plates. The air smells of oil and fresh paint. The Empire's war machine is at its peak. There is laughter in the wardrooms, quiet jokes about American incompetence. Their charts are clean, their plans flawless, or so they believe. And why wouldn't they? 6 months earlier, Pearl Harbor had been reduced to flames. The rising sun seemed unstoppable. But history has a cruel sense of irony. While Japanese officers boast over sake about the weakness of American carriers, across the ocean, in cramped briefing rooms filled with cigarette smoke and stale coffee, U.S. Navy commanders pore over intercepted codes. They are tired, wary, but sharper than their enemy realizes. It is here that the first threads of Midway are pulled together, not with bravado, but with calculation and quiet resolve. Cinematically, picture the contrast. Wide shots of Japanese admirals, their uniforms pristine, their laughter echoing across polished wooden tables. Cut to the Americans, wrinkled khakis, sweat on brows, hands tracing lines across maps with nervous precision. The smell of ink and sweat replaces the perfume of sake. The difference is not just in style, it is in substance. One side mocks, the other prepares. And here lies the hook, the cruel twist that history adores. The very carriers dismissed as inconsequential will, within days, flip the tide of the Pacific. The nuisance will become the nightmare. Japanese arrogance will meet American improvisation, and the meeting place will be a small, seemingly insignificant atoll in the middle of nowhere, Midway. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the laughter of the Japanese commanders fading, replaced by the roar of dive bombers plunging from the sky. You can smell the burning fuel, the acrid smoke of a carrier hit squarely amidships. You can feel the panic as charts are swept aside and perfect plans dissolve into chaos. The mockery ends not with a punchline, but with fire. This is the story we will explore together. How overconfidence, misplaced pride, and a failure to respect the enemy set the stage for one of the most decisive naval battles in history. Stay with us, subscribe to the channel, and join the journey as we unravel the Battle of Midway, scene by scene, error by error, until the laughter stops. The Battle of Midway did not erupt out of nowhere. It was the product of a long chain of decisions, assumptions, and overconfidence. To grasp why Japanese commanders mocked American carriers in the first place, we must return to late 1941, when the Pacific balance of power appeared to lean decisively in Tokyo's favor. After the devastating strike on Pearl Harbor, Japan's naval leaders believed they had secured breathing space for their empire. 6 American battleships lay crippled or sunk, smoke still curling from their twisted hulls. To Japanese planners, this was more than a tactical victory, it was proof of a doctrine. Decisive blows delivered with precision and daring would crush any enemy morale. Carriers, though central to the attack, were not seen as the ultimate tools of victory. In their worldview, carriers were scouts, auxiliaries, useful but hardly decisive. Battleships remained the true, capital ships, the ones that mattered in their calculations. The irony, of course, is painful in hindsight. By underestimating the American carriers that escaped Pearl Harbor, Enterprise, Lexington, Yorktown, and a handful of others, Japanese leaders sowed the seeds of their undoing. They dismissed these ships as fragile, vulnerable to a single well-placed bomb. They mocked the idea that such thin-skinned vessels could stand toe-to-toe with the armored might of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Let us shift to the mood in Tokyo during early 1942. The empire was at its zenith. Hong Kong, Malaya, the Philippines, and Singapore had fallen like dominoes. The Japanese press trumpeted victory after victory, spreading the belief that the Allies were too clumsy, too slow, and too unprepared to respond effectively. Senior officers basked in glory. Diaries from mid-ranking naval officers record a tone of supreme confidence, even arrogance. One naval aviator scribbled that, "The Americans will surely flee as they did before." To him, and many like him, the Pacific was already a Japanese lake. Meanwhile, in Washington, the tone could not have been more different. Reports from Pearl Harbor described chaos, loss, and humiliation. The smell of charred oil lingered over the harbor for weeks, a haunting reminder of the fleet's vulnerability. But within that despair, a steelier mindset emerged. American officers realized something fundamental. Battleships had failed them, and carriers, those very ships mocked by Japan, were now the only tools with reach and flexibility. In this disparity of perceptions lies the problem. Japan, confident and dismissive, aimed to lure what remained of the U.S. fleet into a trap at Midway, confident of a repeat of Pearl Harbor. America, wounded yet calculating, prepared to turn the trap against its maker. The collision course was set. Let us examine the human side of this problem. For Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, the situation was both triumphant and troubling. He had dealt the Americans a shocking blow, yet he knew the industrial might of the United States was vast. His private letters reveal a note of caution. He feared what America could do once it truly mobilized. Yet many of his subordinates drowned out his worries with confidence bordering on arrogance. The Americans, they said, lacked spirit. Their carriers were floating gas cans, unworthy of serious respect. Contrast this with Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet. He inherited a fleet reeling from disaster. Yet rather than despair, he seized on the very weapon Japan mocked. With only 3 carriers immediately available, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, he devised a bold counterstrike plan. To him, the carrier was not a fragile liability but the centerpiece of a new kind of naval warfare. This divergence crystallized the central problem. One side clung to past doctrines, convinced of their superiority. The other adapted, leveraging weakness into innovation. Japan sought to annihilate. America sought to survive, and in survival lay the possibility of victory. Consider the geography of Midway itself. A small atoll, barely a speck on the map, it seemed unworthy of grand strategy. Yet its position, roughly equidistant between Asia and North America, gave it outsized importance. To Japan, seizing Midway would extend its defensive perimeter and deliver a psychological blow. To America, holding it meant preventing Japanese bombers from threatening Hawaii and the West Coast. Midway became the fulcrum of 2 conflicting visions, one of expansion, the other of defense. By late May 1942, the pieces were moving. Japanese fleets sailed with supreme confidence, convinced they were luring American carriers into destruction. American codebreakers, however, had already pierced enough of their signals to know the target was Midway. The stage was set for an encounter that neither side fully anticipated. The problem, therefore, was not simply tactical, it was psychological. Japan entered the battle with overconfidence, dismissing the very weapons that would undo them. America entered battered but adaptive, willing to gamble on intelligence, improvisation, and sheer resilience. It is this tension, the arrogance of one side, the desperation of the other, that gives Midway its cinematic power. The mocking laughter of Japanese officers in the spring of 1942 would soon echo hollowly against the roar of American aircraft diving from the clouds. The stage was ready. The question was no longer whether carriers mattered, but which nation could wield them with greater skill, speed, and ruthlessness. And so, as June 4th approached, the Pacific grew quiet, the waves hiding fleets on a collision course. The world was about to discover that fragile-looking decks of steel could alter the fate of nations. At Midway, the central problem was not merely one of ships or aircraft, but of perception. Japanese commanders, blinded by arrogance, underestimated the striking power of American carriers. U.S. leaders, humbled by Pearl Harbor, embraced adaptation and intelligence-driven warfare. This clash of confidence versus resilience transformed a remote atoll into the crucible where carrier warfare proved decisive, and where mockery turned into catastrophic miscalculation. Understanding why Midway unfolded as it did requires looking beneath the explosions and headlines into the mechanics of naval warfare in 1942. At the heart of those mechanics was the aircraft carrier, a machine that the Japanese both pioneered and misunderstood. They mocked it as fragile, a thin-skinned airfield on water, dismissing the idea that such a vessel could decide an empire's fate. Yet fragility hides a paradox. A battleship's guns could hurl shells 20 miles. A carrier's planes could strike targets hundreds of miles away. In a war fought over oceans the size of continents, that reach was everything. To sneer at the carrier was to underestimate the very weapon that had brought victory at Pearl Harbor. But weapons are nothing without intelligence to guide them. Here the Americans gained their first advantage, not with steel but with pencils, radios, and patience. At Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, cryptanalysts hunched over reams of coded Japanese transmissions, strings of meaningless numbers slowly bent into sense by human insight. When they suspected that AF was the Japanese code for Midway, they set a trap of their own, a false report of a water shortage broadcast in the clear. When Japanese intercepts soon repeated that AF is short on water, the deception confirmed the target. Long before dive bombers took off, the battle's outline had been drawn. The Japanese believed their code unbreakable. Their overconfidence turned their fleet into a predictable target. The carriers, once guided by intelligence, became floating factories of warplanes, each launching fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. These aircraft were not equal, and their differences explain much of what followed. The Japanese Mitsubishi Zero was a sleek predator, unmatched in agility, compared to the American Wildcat, a stubby, slower machine. On paper the Zero was superior, but in combat the Wildcat's heavier armor and guns allowed it to take damage and keep fighting, a trait that mattered when survival meant another chance to strike. The dauntless dive bomber, an American workhorse, proved decisive. Its rugged design and ability to dive steeply made it the scalpel of Midway, while Japan's Val bomber, though accurate in earlier battles, lacked the resilience to withstand mounting American resistance. The contrast in torpedo planes was sharper still. Japan's modern Kate carried effective torpedoes, while America's Devastator, obsolete and slow, seemed almost suicidal. Yet here irony took the stage. These outdated Devastators, cut down in waves of fire, pulled Japanese fighters low and scattered them, opening the sky above for the Dauntless to arrive unopposed. Imagine a commentator sketching the matchup for an audience not with a dry list but with vivid contrasts. Japan fielded Zeros that danced like rapiers, Americans countered with Wildcats that absorbed punishment like blunt shields. Japan sent out Vals and Kates as precise spears, while America relied on Dauntless, heavy blades that struck when the opponent least expected. These differences were not abstract. They shaped the timing, the chaos, and ultimately the destruction that rained down on Japanese carriers that June morning. Doctrine magnified these contrasts. Japanese planners believed in coordinated mass, launch entire waves of aircraft, strike in unison, recover together. Elegant in theory, it was brittle in practice. The Americans, with fewer carriers, launched when ready, producing scattered, uncoordinated strikes. What seemed disorder turned into an accidental advantage. Japanese defenders, expecting one massive blow, instead faced a drip feed of raids, never sure when the next would arrive. And when they tried to rearm their planes for a second strike, shifting from bombs to torpedoes in crowded hangars, they created tinderboxes below decks, fuel hoses uncoiled, explosives stacked carelessly, all in the rush of battle. Into this moment of vulnerability, dauntless dive bombers arrived. In 5 minutes 3 proud carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, became infernos. Behind the spectacle of flames lay the question of endurance. Japan had sailed far from its bases, its oil stretched thin, its replacement capacity limited. Every carrier represented years of labor and scarce resources. America, by contrast, was already awakening its industrial giant. Even as Midway unfolded, shipyards on both coasts laid keels for new Essex-class carriers, factories rolled out aircraft by the thousands. For Japan, losing a carrier was a crippling blow. For America, though each loss hurt, replacement was possible, inevitable. This imbalance meant Midway was not just a single battle. It was the beginning of a war Japan could not replace. Chance added its own hand. Japanese scouts launched late, missing critical sightings. American pilots nearly lost their bearings over empty ocean, yet stumbled upon the enemy at the precise instant when defenses were weakest. War is never a clean equation. It is a storm where doctrine, machines, and human frailty collide with luck. The mechanisms of Midway included weather and error as surely as bombs and bullets. And above it all was the human factor. Machines extended power, but minds directed it. Japanese commanders clung to an outdated vision of sea power, enthralled by the prestige of battleships, blinded by their own success. American leaders like Nimitz, Fletcher, and Spruance accepted uncertainty, gambled on intelligence, and trusted pilots flying into near-suicidal missions. They turned weakness into advantage, improvisation into doctrine. In their hands, carriers were not fragile liabilities but decisive weapons. Thus, the technical story of Midway is not a catalogue of numbers but a web of interlocking mechanisms. Carriers extended reach beyond the horizon. Intelligence turned secrets into foresight. Aircraft, each with their strengths and flaws, shaped the rhythm of attack and defense. Doctrine determined timing, logistics determined survival, chance shaped opportunity, and human decision bound them together. Japan failed to respect the fragility of its perfection. America recognized its own imperfection and weaponized it. Midway was not a victory of luck alone. It was the collision of arrogance with adaptation, written in steel decks and smoke rising into the Pacific sky. The road to Midway began not with the roar of engines but with the rustle of maps across polished tables in Tokyo. In late May 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's grand design appeared flawless. The combined fleet would advance across the Pacific, seize Midway Atoll, and lure the last American carriers into a crushing ambush. The plan was sketched with the precision of a chess master moving his final pieces. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, escorted by battleships and cruisers, would descend upon the tiny atoll, while a diversionary force struck north toward the Aleutians. To Japan's admirals, the Americans were weakened, their spirit broken after Pearl Harbor and the fall of the Philippines. A single decisive blow would finish them. Confidence oozed from every briefing. Officers joked about the fragility of American carriers, floating airstrips that could never stand against the might of the rising sun. Pearl Harbor's smoking ruins seemed proof enough. Yet beneath the bravado, a few voices muttered concerns. Junior officers scribbled in diaries about overstretched supply lines, divided forces, and the dangers of underestimating an enemy still reeling but not yet beaten. These doubts were drowned in the tide of arrogance. Victory, they believed, was inevitable. Across the ocean, in cramped rooms lit by red lamps, a different scene played out. At Pearl Harbor Station HYPO, codebreakers hunched over intercepted Japanese transmissions, turning strings of numbers into fragments of meaning. When they suspected AF was Midway, they planted a message about a water shortage. Days later, Japanese communications confirmed AF is short on water. The deception worked. Yamamoto's supposedly unbreakable code had betrayed him. Chester Nimitz, calm and precise, acted quickly. He moved Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown northeast of Midway. It was a bold inversion. The hunter would become the hunted. By early June, 2 vast fleets converged on a patch of ocean smaller than a speck on the map. Japan's armada dwarfed the American force, its ships bristling with guns and its air wings seasoned from months of victories. The Americans brought only 3 carriers, a handful of cruisers, and destroyers. On paper, the imbalance was absurd. Yet unseen by Japanese eyes, intelligence tilted the scales. The night of June 3rd was restless on Midway. Marines patrolled the beaches under a moonless sky, the surf slapping against the reef. The humid air carried the smell of fuel and salt, while out to sea, Japanese crews slept in hammocks, secure in the belief that their enemy had been caught unprepared. In carrier cabins to the east, American pilots smoked nervously, listening to whispered briefings. They traced their routes across maps smudged with sweat and ink, knowing that dawn would decide far more than their own fates. That morning, American patrol planes spotted the vanguard of the Japanese fleet. Though their bombing runs inflicted little damage, their sightings confirmed the enemy's approach. On Midway's runway, engines coughed to life before the sun broke the horizon. B-17 flying fortresses lumbered into the air, joined by Marine dive bombers, hastily modified B-26 Marauders carrying torpedoes, and even a few antiquated fighters. Against the precision of Japanese naval aviation, they looked like relics. Yet their mission was not to win but to buy time, to harass, to keep the Japanese off balance. When the Japanese strike force arrived around 6:30 a.m., the island erupted in fire. Dive bombers screamed through clouds of flak, dropping explosives that tore into hangars and barracks. Torpedoes churned white wakes through the lagoon. Fuel tanks ignited, sending columns of black smoke into the sky. The ground trembled under the impact, the air thick with acrid fumes. Marines clung to anti-aircraft guns, tracers arcing upward in desperate defense. The scene was chaos, men shouting over the roar of engines, sand kicked into their faces by the blast of explosions, the sky streaked with flames. A radioman later wrote in his log that it felt as though the sky itself was collapsing. Buildings shattered, oil burned in choking plumes, and the island seemed to buckle under the weight of the assault. Yet when the dust cleared, the runway still stretched intact across the coral surface. Against all odds, Midway's airfield had survived. Aircraft could still launch, and launch they would. For the Japanese, this result was troubling. The first strike had punished the island but not destroyed it. To neutralize Midway completely, a second wave was necessary. Orders were given to rearm planes with bombs for another strike on the atoll. At that same moment, reports arrived of American ships sighted in the area. In a rush, crews began switching ordnance again, torpedoes for bombs, bombs for torpedoes. Below decks, hangars filled with live munitions and fuel lines. The carriers became floating powder kegs, one spark away from catastrophe. Meanwhile, the first American counterattacks reached the Japanese fleet. B-26 Marauders and Devastator torpedo planes came skimming across the waves, flying low and slow. Japanese anti-aircraft fire erupted, and Zero fighters pounced from above. The American formations were shredded. Bombers disintegrated mid-air, pilots bailed into the sea, and burning wrecks trailed smoke as they fell. Losses were staggering, almost total. And yet, in failing, they achieved something critical. Every gunner on the Japanese carriers was firing outward, every fighter committed to chasing lumbering attackers at low altitude. Commanders were forced to delay rearming cycles, to break concentration, to disperse defenses. What looked like futile sacrifice was, in truth, setting the stage for the decisive act still to come. By mid-morning of June 4th, the Pacific sky above Midway was littered with smoke trails and burning planes. The Japanese carriers had survived the first American strikes, but they were scattered, distracted, and dangerously vulnerable. Their decks were crowded with armed aircraft, their hangars cluttered with explosives, and their commanders caught between striking the island again or turning to face the American fleet. The trap Yamamoto had laid now threatened to snap shut on his own arm. The clock edged toward late morning as the Americans pressed their attacks. The torpedo squadrons had been nearly annihilated. From Yorktown, Hornet, and Enterprise, Devastators had flown straight into walls of steel and fire. Pilots knew the odds before they took off, yet they went anyway. Of the 41 aircraft launched, only a handful returned. Survivors staggered back to their carriers with bullet-riddled wings, fuel streaming from punctured tanks, their crews dazed but alive. The sacrifice had been enormous, but it had not been in vain. While Japanese gunners and fighters were dragged downward to deal with the slow, doomed torpedo planes, a different threat approached from the sky above. Far to the north, delayed by navigational confusion and the vastness of the Pacific, squadrons of dauntless dive bombers finally sighted the Japanese fleet. They had wandered for hours, low on fuel, some nearly ready to turn back. Then, almost by miracle, they arrived at the precise moment when their enemy was most exposed. Below them lay a sight of staggering vulnerability. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu sailed in close formation, their decks crowded with aircraft in various stages of refueling and rearming. Open fuel hoses snaked across steel, bombs and torpedoes lay scattered on carts, sailors rushed in frantic preparation. Defenses were thin, Zeros were busy chasing low-flying attackers, anti-aircraft crews distracted by threats from the horizon. From high altitude, the decks looked like targets painted in fire. At 10:20 a.m., the Dauntless folded their wings, pointed their noses downward, and dived. The world dissolved into screaming wind and blurred ocean. Pilots pulled their triggers as the decks rushed upward, bombs dropping free to trace black arcs toward steel. In those fateful 5 minutes, the course of the Pacific War was rewritten. Kaga was the first to be struck. Bombs punched through her flight deck, igniting the fueled and armed planes below. Explosions ripped upward, flames tearing across the hangar. Men were thrown overboard as fire consumed the ship. Soryu followed, hit squarely amidships. Her elevators became chimneys of flame, ammunition cooked off in deafening blasts. On Akagi, a single well-placed bomb tore into the command deck, setting off secondary detonations that engulfed the flagship of the First Air Fleet. Eyewitnesses described the carriers erupting like volcanoes, towering columns of smoke curling thousands of feet into the sky. The air stank of burning oil and scorched metal. Survivors leapt into the sea, clinging to debris as their proud ships became floating pyres. Japanese officers who had mocked American carriers only days before now watched in stunned disbelief as half their striking power disappeared in a matter of minutes. For a brief, terrible moment, the battle seemed almost over. 3 of Japan's 4 carriers lay mortally wounded, their flight decks ruined, their air wings annihilated. Yet Hiryu, the lone survivor, remained afloat and defiant. Her crew worked feverishly to launch counterstrikes. By early afternoon, waves of bombers and torpedo planes were hurtling toward the American fleet. Yorktown bore the brunt. At first, her gunners repelled attackers, filling the sky with tracers. Then bombs found their mark, tearing through the flight deck, blowing apart compartments below. Fires raged. Crewmen fought desperately to contain the damage. Within hours she was struck again, this time by torpedoes that listed her sharply to port. For a moment it seemed she would share the fate of the Japanese carriers, but damage control teams performed miracles, keeping her afloat long enough to absorb blows that might otherwise have fallen on her sisters. Even as Yorktown burned, American scouts located Hiryu. By late afternoon, dauntless dive bombers struck again, descending on the last proud survivor of Nagumo's force. Their bombs smashed into her decks, igniting fires impossible to control. By nightfall, Hiryu was a blazing wreck, left to drift until her crew abandoned ship. The First Air Fleet, the same carriers that had humbled Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, was no more. The speed of the reversal was breathtaking. In a single day, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and irreplaceable veteran crews. What had begun with confidence and mockery ended with shock and silence. The men who had laughed about American weakness now clung to rafts in oil-stained seas, watching the sun sink over a horizon that no longer belonged to them. Yet victory was not clean, not simple. The Americans had suffered, too. Yorktown, battered beyond salvation, would eventually slip beneath the waves. Scores of pilots and crews had been lost in suicidal attacks that paved the way for success. Midway was no triumph without cost. It was a gamble paid in blood. But the scale of the outcome could not be denied. In 5 minutes of fire and chaos, the balance of the Pacific War shifted. The mockery of American carriers had evaporated in flames, replaced by a grudging respect paid too late. Midway was not just a battle won, it was the turning of the tide. Night fell on June 4th with the Pacific lit by burning ships. Columns of smoke still curled upward from the shattered hulks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, drifting wrecks on a darkened sea. Hiryu, though aflame, clung to life through the night until her remaining crew abandoned her. By dawn on June 5th, she too slipped beneath the waves, leaving only oil slicks and floating debris as testimony to what had been the mightiest carrier strike force on Earth. The Japanese fleet, stunned, pulled back into the western Pacific. What had begun with plans of ambush ended in scattered retreat. Yet for the Americans, the victory was bittersweet. Yorktown, hero of Coral Sea and Midway, had absorbed punishment beyond endurance. Listing badly, she was taken under tow. Her crew had fought fire and flood with extraordinary skill, and for a time it seemed she might survive to sail again. But fate had another twist to deliver. On June 6th, as salvage operations continued, The Japanese submarine I-168 crept silently into range. With a sudden eruption of torpedoes, the undersea Predator struck Yorktown and the destroyer Hammond, which lay alongside providing power and pumps. Hammond broke apart in an instant, sinking with many of her crew. Yorktown shuddered, fires reignited, compartments flooded. Efforts to save her failed. Slowly, almost with dignity, she rolled to starboard and disappeared beneath the waves. Sailors clinging to rafts watched their ship vanish into the depths, the sea swallowing the scarred steel that had carried them into history. For the Americans, the loss of Yorktown was painful but not paralyzing. The essential fact remained: 4 Japanese carriers were gone, along with their elite pilots and deck crews. For Japan, this was a wound from which they could never recover. Shipyards back home lacked the capacity to replace the losses quickly. Training pipelines could not replenish the vanished experience of men who had flown since the early days of the war. Each sunken carrier represented not just steel and aircraft but years of irreplaceable skill. Survivors told their stories with dazed disbelief. Japanese sailors remembered leaping into seas thick with oil, clinging to wreckage while explosions echoed from their dying ships. Some wept openly as they watched the flames consume their proud carriers. American pilots, equally shaken, described the surreal sight of 3 enemy carriers burning at once, a vision so sudden and absolute that it seemed impossible. One aviator recalled circling above in his Dauntless, astonished that so much power could vanish in the span of minutes. The irony was cruel and unmistakable. These were the same carriers that had ravaged Pearl Harbor only 6 months before, symbols of invincibility. Now they were twisted skeletons beneath the Pacific waves. The commanders who had scoffed at American carriers learned too late that mockery was no shield against bombs plunging from the sky. The fragile decks they had derided had instead delivered the decisive blows of the battle. Midway did not end the war. Battles would rage across the Solomon Islands, in the Coral Sea, through the Marianas and beyond. But Midway ended the illusion of Japanese supremacy. The aura of invincibility surrounding the Imperial Navy shattered in a single day. From then on, Japan would fight a defensive war, reacting to American moves rather than dictating them. For the United States, battered but unbroken, Midway was a revelation that adaptation, intelligence, and sacrifice could overcome even the most formidable enemy. On the beaches of Midway itself, Marines cleared wreckage and buried their dead. The island smelled of charred fuel, of scorched coral and burned rubber, yet its runway remained usable. Aircraft continued to launch and land, proof that Japan's decisive strike had failed. For the garrison, survival itself felt like victory. Letters home spoke of exhaustion, pride, and grief. They had stood at the hinge of history and endured. In Tokyo, the news was received with shock and disbelief. Initial reports downplayed the losses, but word spread quickly among naval officers. The pride of the fleet was gone. Yamamoto, who had gambled everything on one great battle, withdrew his ships into the night, knowing the opportunity for decisive victory had vanished forever. For the Americans, the aftermath was both somber and electric. Newspapers splashed headlines of triumph, but for the sailors who had fought it was the faces of lost comrades that lingered most. Victory had been purchased at terrible cost, yet it carried with it a sense of destiny. Midway proved that the United States could not only endure but strike back, that its carriers, dismissed as fragile, were in fact the heart of a new kind of naval war. As dawn broke on June 7th, the Pacific seemed unchanged, endless waves, cloudless skies, the horizon stretching into infinity. But beneath the surface, 4 Japanese carriers lay silent, steel tombs for thousands of men. The sea had swallowed arrogance, ambition, and the illusion of dominance. Above, the American flag still flew over Midway Atoll, its battered runway standing as proof that the tide of war had turned. Midway was not merely a clash of steel and fire, it was a collision of doctrines, assumptions, and attitudes. The Japanese entered the battle with numerical strength and a record of victory, yet their confidence blinded them to their own vulnerabilities. The Americans arrived with fewer carriers and less experienced crews, but they wielded intelligence and adaptability with precision. The contrast between the two sides reveals why one fleet sank beneath the waves while the other sailed on. At the heart of the Japanese failure lay overconfidence. 6 months of unbroken triumph had convinced their commanders that American resistance was fragile, that U.S. carriers could not withstand the disciplined power of the First Air Fleet. This arrogance colored every decision, from splitting forces between the Aleutians and Midway, to underestimating the resilience of Midway's defenders, to mocking the very carriers that would undo them. By believing their own myth of invincibility, they walked straight into a trap. The Americans, by contrast, embraced humility born of disaster. Pearl Harbor had seared the Navy, stripping away illusions. At Coral Sea, they had fought to a bloody draw. Nimitz and his commanders knew they could not rely on brute force. They needed intelligence and improvisation. Breaking the Japanese code gave them an invisible weapon: foresight. Armed with knowledge of Yamamoto's plan, they seized the initiative even while appearing weaker. The clash of doctrines was equally stark. Japan favored elegant mass strikes. Entire waves of aircraft launched together, recovered together, rearmed together. In practice, this meant that when things went wrong, everything went wrong at once. The hangars became crowded with planes and explosives, the decks clogged with fuel lines, and the margin for error shrank to zero. The Americans, with fewer resources, adopted a cruder but more flexible approach: launch when ready, strike piecemeal. What seemed like disorganization in fact created unpredictability, forcing Japanese defenders to react constantly, never able to concentrate on a single threat. Technology played its role. The Zero fighter was unmatched in agility, but it lacked armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. American Wildcats could absorb damage and keep fighting. The Japanese Val and Kate were accurate and modern, but their crews could not be replaced quickly. The American Devastators were obsolete, almost suicidal, but their doomed attacks dragged Zeros downward, leaving the skies open for dauntless dive bombers. Ironically, weakness became strength. Outdated aircraft sacrificed themselves to set up the decisive blow. Logistics compounded the problem. Japan had extended its reach thousands of miles from home bases, with limited fuel and replacement capacity. Each carrier lost was a wound that could not heal. The United States, by contrast, was beginning to unleash its industrial might. Even as Yorktown sank, new Essex-class carriers were already under construction. Japan gambled everything on one perfect battle. America prepared for a long, grinding war. Chance, too, shaped the outcome, but chance favored the prepared. Japanese scouts launched late, missing the American carriers until it was too late. American dive bombers, nearly lost over empty ocean, stumbled upon the enemy at the exact moment of vulnerability. Fortune is never impartial. It bends toward those who make space for it. Nimitz did not count on luck, but he left room for it to tip the scales. Nagumo, obsessed with perfection, left no margin. The most decisive mistake was psychological. Japan failed to respect its enemy. Mockery blinded them to the reality that American carriers had already struck at Coral Sea, that intelligence could unravel even the most secret plan, that desperation breeds resilience. By assuming weakness, they created weakness in themselves. The Americans, on the other hand, assumed danger at every turn. They expected disaster and planned for it. When it came, they bent but did not break. The contrast could be drawn as a simple equation. Japan, superiority in numbers, experience, and early momentum, undone by arrogance, rigidity, and poor reconnaissance. America, inferiority in ships and training, rescued by intelligence, improvisation, and sheer resolve. Midway was not won by luck alone, nor lost by luck alone. It was won by preparation and humility, lost by hubris and blindness. When viewed through this lens, Midway becomes not just a battle but a parable. The Japanese fleet was undone by its own assumptions, by the very belief that had fueled its rise. The Americans, chastened and scarred, found strength in doubt. In war, as in life, certainty can be deadly, while caution can become a weapon. Midway proved that arrogance may win the opening moves, but humility wins the game. Midway's aftermath rippled far beyond the wrecks sinking into the Pacific. For Japan, the shock was immediate and profound. The loss of 4 carriers, the pride of their navy, the veterans of Pearl Harbor, was not just a tactical defeat, but a strategic fracture. Their carefully honed doctrine of carrier warfare, perfected through years of training and victory, had been exposed as brittle. From this moment, Japan's naval war would be reactive, never again on the offensive in the same sweeping fashion. The material consequences were devastating. Each sunken carrier represented more than steel and machinery. It meant the loss of hundreds of pilots and deck crew whose training could not be replaced. Japan's aviation program was selective, long, and rigorous, producing elite flyers in small numbers. Replacing them would take years the empire did not have. By contrast, the United States ramped up training schools, graduating pilots in waves. They were less polished at first, but the system valued quantity and continuity. In war measured by attrition, that system proved decisive. The psychological impact was equally stark. In Tokyo, officials sought to hide the scale of the defeat, but whispers spread among naval circles. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Imperial Navy since Pearl Harbor cracked. Officers began to question Yamamoto's gamble, and though he remained a towering figure, doubt seeped into the once unshakable faith in decisive battle. Sailors and pilots, too, felt the shift. Where once they had spoken of destiny, now they spoke of endurance. In Washington, the victory electrified a weary public. Headlines blared news of the triumph. 4 Japanese carriers destroyed for the loss of 1 American. The morale boost was incalculable. At a stroke, Midway erased the specter of Pearl Harbor, proving that the United States could not only withstand the storm but turn it back. Roosevelt and his administration seized the moment, presenting Midway as the turning point that justified continued mobilization. Factories roared, shipyards clanged, and the arsenal of democracy accelerated to full power. Strategically, Midway shifted the balance of initiative. Japan had aimed to lure the American fleet into a trap, crush it, and secure dominance across the Pacific. Instead, their traps snapped shut on themselves. From then on, Japan abandoned the luxury of choosing where to strike. They were forced into a defensive crouch, reacting to American advances in the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and eventually the Central Pacific thrust through the Gilberts, Marshalls, and Marianas. Midway did not end Japanese expansion, it ended Japanese freedom of choice. The battle also reshaped naval doctrine worldwide. Before Midway, many still doubted whether carriers had truly supplanted battleships as the decisive weapons of war. After Midway, the debate was finished. 4 fleet carriers destroyed in a single day by aircraft launched from other carriers. This was proof beyond question. Battleships would play supporting roles, but the age of the carrier had arrived, written in fire and oil on the waters of Midway. Culturally, Midway entered American memory as legend. Newspapers hailed it as a miracle, the incredible victory achieved against odds. Films and memoirs painted the dive bombers as avenging angels, the sacrifice of torpedo squadrons as tragic yet necessary. The battle became a story of redemption, Pearl Harbor avenged, America's honor restored. For veterans, though, the memory was darker. Pilots recalled the terror of endless ocean, the smell of burning oil, the faces of friends who never returned. Sailors remembered pulling survivors from oily waters, hearing their screams fade into silence. For them, Midway was not miracle but ordeal. For Japan, memory took a different shape. Survivors spoke of disbelief, of watching flames race across their proud ships, of abandoning vessels they believed unsinkable. In post-war reflections, many officers admitted that arrogance had blinded them. Some even confessed that they had underestimated American ingenuity, assuming the enemy lacked the discipline to strike back with precision. Midway haunted them as a lesson learned too late. In the broader arc of the war, Midway was a hinge. Without it, Japan might have continued to expand, threatening Australia, India, or even Hawaii again. With it, the momentum shifted irreversibly. The Guadalcanal campaign soon followed, a brutal test of endurance that Japan could ill afford. Each month after Midway, America's strength grew while Japan's dwindled. By 1944, when the Marianas fell and the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot destroyed Japan's remaining air power, the seed sown at Midway had fully blossomed. The long-term influence extended even into the Cold War. Midway's lessons in code-breaking, intelligence fusion, and carrier warfare shaped U.S. doctrine for decades. The importance of signals intelligence, demonstrated by the breaking of JN-25, became a pillar of modern warfare. The principle that arrogance invites disaster, that underestimating an enemy can be fatal, echoed in military academies worldwide. Midway became case study as much as legend. Yet perhaps the most enduring impact was human. For the men who fought, the battle marked them forever. Diaries speak of nightmares, of pride, of grief. Some wrote of the strange beauty of the Pacific skies, juxtaposed with the horror of burning ships. Others confessed survivors' guilt, wondering why they lived when so many died. Their voices remind us that beneath the grand strategies and shifting tides of war, Midway was also a human story, of courage, error, sacrifice, and chance. In the end, Midway was both culmination and beginning. It culminated Japan's early war of expansion, exposing the limits of ambition unchecked by caution. It began America's long offensive, the grinding advance across the Pacific that would end in Tokyo Bay 3 years later. The laughter of Japanese commanders mocking American carriers in early 1942 was silenced forever at Midway. In its place rose the steady hum of American industry, the determination of a nation now certain of victory. History often speaks loudest through irony. At Midway, the commanders who laughed at American carriers found their own vessels burning beneath the Pacific waves. The battle revealed not just the shifting power of nations but the dangers of arrogance. It showed how overconfidence blinds, how underestimation destroys, and how resilience can turn weakness into strength. The mockery of early 1942 ended in silence, broken only by the roar of dive bombers and the crackle of flames. The lessons endure. First, intelligence matters as much as firepower. Without code-breaking, the Americans would have been blind. With it, they fought with foresight. Second, flexibility trumps rigidity. Japan's perfectionist doctrine left no room for error, while America's improvised strikes, chaotic though they seemed, created the opening for victory. Third, respect your enemy. To dismiss an opponent as incapable is to invite disaster. Midway reminds us that underestimating an adversary is the quickest path to ruin. But beyond the analysis lies the human truth. Young men, barely out of school, hurled themselves into the skies knowing they might never return. Sailors battled fire and flood with bare hands. Some survived to tell their stories, many did not. Midway was not only a turning point in strategy, it was a crucible of sacrifice. The ocean still holds their memories, the silent witness to courage and loss. If we strip away the uniforms and the flags, what remains is a universal lesson. Humility is a weapon, arrogance a weakness. Every generation faces its own Midway, a test of whether it will listen to warnings, respect its challenges, and prepare with wisdom, or whether it will be seduced by the illusion of invincibility. For viewers today, the echoes of Midway still matter. In a world filled with uncertainty, the battle's lessons remind us that power is fragile, and victory belongs not to the proudest, but to the most prepared. This has been our journey through the Battle of Midway, scene by scene, mistake by mistake, until the laughter stopped and history changed. If you've stayed with us this far, thank you. To keep exploring untold stories of history with us, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if this story gripped you, and share it with those who should hear the lessons of Midway. Each click, each subscription, helps us bring more battles, more voices, more forgotten moments back to life. Because history is not just the past, it is the mirror in which we see ourselves. Midway is not only the tale of 1942, it is a warning for every age. And together, through stories like this, we keep that warning alive.